Story 1. A Craigslist Nightmare. I'm 28 years old, and about a month ago, I moved into a new apartment. As anyone who's moved recently knows, finding furniture on a budget is a challenge. After scouring local stores, I turned to Craigslist. I found a listing for a couch that looked perfect, nice leather, stylish, and the price seemed like a bargain. The seller had posted a few photos, and from the pictures, the couch looked almost brand new. The ad wasn't very detailed, but I figured it would be worth reaching out. The email address he provided was darkstormer93@hotmail.com. It seemed a little strange, but I didn't give it too much thought. I sent him a message offering the full asking price, hoping he'd accept. To my surprise, he responded almost immediately, saying the couch was still available and asking for my address. That's when the first alarm went off in my head. I felt uneasy about the idea of having some random stranger come to my apartment. I had just moved in and didn't want someone showing up at my door. I suggested I could come to his place to pick up the couch instead, but he insisted very forcefully that he come to me. He said it was easier for him and that he could help me move the couch in. This made me even more uncomfortable. I didn't reply for a few hours, but he emailed again, this time with his address, saying he could come by that afternoon if I was still interested. I sat there, looking at the email, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Still, it felt like a steal, almost too good to be true, and the thought of getting this couch for such a low price kept nagging at me. After some back and forth, I gave in. I decided to go to the address he'd sent. It wasn't far, maybe about a 15-minute drive from my place. As I pulled up to his street, I immediately noticed something odd. The houses on the block were all well maintained and looked fairly upscale. But the house I was looking for was small, much smaller than the others around it. It looked run down, like it had been forgotten by time. The yard was overgrown, and there were piles of random junk scattered around. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if this was a bad idea, but I told myself I was being paranoid. I parked my van on the street and rang the bell. A middle-aged man answered the door, wearing a baseball cap and a faded t-shirt. He flashed a wide smile that felt too eager, almost forced, and invited me inside without hesitation. I took a deep breath and followed him into the house, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling of unease building in my stomach. As soon as I stepped inside, I was hit with the smell of stale air. The living room was dimly lit, with curtains drawn and only a single lamp flickering weakly in the corner. The couch I had seen in the pictures was sitting in the middle of the room, but it wasn't at all like what I had expected. The leather was scuffed, scratched in a few places, and there were small tears along the seams. The cushions were sunken in, and the fabric looked worn out. I frowned. "This isn't what I saw in the photos," I said, trying to sound polite. The man just smiled and nodded. "Yeah, it's seen better days, but I'm willing to lower the price if you're interested." I shook my head. "I don't think it's what I'm looking for." I started walking toward the door, planning to leave. But as I turned to leave, he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You know, I'll give it to you for free if you're willing to, give me something in return." I froze. My mind raced, and I could feel the blood draining from my face. He was standing way too close to me now, and his smile had turned into something much more sinister. I pulled away from him, feeling my skin crawl. I didn't say anything, just turned and hurried to the door. I felt like I couldn't get out of there fast enough. As I stepped out onto the porch, I glanced back over my shoulder. He was still standing in the doorway, watching me. I quickly got into my van, slamming the door shut. Without looking back, I drove off, my heart pounding in my chest. That night, after I'd settled in at home, I was watching TV, trying to unwind. Everything felt quiet, normal, until I heard it. The unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps stomping up the steps to my front porch. I froze, listening, heart hammering in my chest. The sound came closer, and then I heard the sound of my front doorknob being turned. My breath caught in my throat. Someone was trying to get in. I quickly muted the TV and crept over to the front door, peering through the peephole. But there was no one there. The porch was empty. Still on edge, I stepped back, but just as I was about to move away, I heard the gate to my backyard creek open. And then it slammed shut. My heart dropped into my stomach. I rushed to grab my phone and dialed 911, all while listening carefully. I could hear the faint sound of the back door being tested, someone fiddling with the knob, trying to get in. I shouted through the door, "I've called the cops." And just like that, the sound stopped. The gate creaked open again, and then the silence settled over the yard. I stayed by the door, listening, until I was sure the person was gone. When I checked outside, there was no sign of anyone. That was a month ago. Since then, nothing has happened. But I still can't shake the feeling that it was the man from Craigslist who followed me home. I don't care what anyone says, it wasn't a coincidence. It's been hard to sleep ever since, and I've started looking for a new place to live. I'm not using Craigslist again, and I don't plan on meeting any strangers in person anytime soon. The whole thing still doesn't sit right with me.
Story 2. The Robber's Bait. I decided to clear out some old stuff from my house by posting an ad on Craigslist. Since I was planning to move soon, I figured it was the perfect time to get rid of things I no longer used. While going through my things, I found a set of old camping gear, some tents, a couple of sleeping bags, and a small portable stove. It had been ages since I used any of it, and it was just sitting in the closet gathering dust. I snapped a few pictures and posted them for sale, asking for $80 for everything. The gear was in pretty good condition, so it seemed like a fair price. Within an hour, I got a couple of replies. One was asking if I'd accept $50, but I politely declined. The second message was from someone who seemed genuinely interested and said they'd take the gear for the listed price. They mentioned they'd be able to pick it up later that evening. I agreed and set a time for 6 p.m., thinking it would give me enough time to finish up some things around the house. I usually didn't let people inside when selling stuff, so I planned to just meet the buyer in the driveway where I could quickly hand over the gear. At 6 p.m., I was standing outside with everything ready to go. But then, just as I was about to head out to the driveway, I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone else, so I went to answer it. Standing there was a man I hadn't seen before, who introduced himself as the person buying the camping gear. "Hi, I'm a bit early. Hope that's okay," he said, glancing at his watch. I told him no problem, and he followed me out to the driveway where the items were laid out. I offered to let him test the stove, just to be sure everything worked, and he agreed. After a quick test, he said everything seemed fine. But then, out of nowhere, he dropped a bombshell. "Actually, I've only got $40 on me right now. Is that all right?" he asked. I was taken aback. The agreed price was $80, and suddenly, he was offering half. I explained that $40 wasn't enough, and that I'd already told him the price. He seemed insistent, but I just shook my head, trying to stay polite but firm. Without another word, he turned around, walked back to his car, and drove off without paying a cent. A little while later, there was another knock on my door. I was about to ignore it, but then I heard a familiar voice calling out, "Hey, I got the money now, I'll take the camping gear." I froze. My instincts told me something was off, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Still, I decided to peek through the peephole, and sure enough, it was the same guy from earlier. He was standing there, looking a little too eager. Instead of opening the door, I quickly called the non-emergency police line and explained the situation, mentioning his car and the strange behavior. The dispatcher assured me they'd send someone to check things out. The man continued to knock, getting more impatient as time passed. A few minutes later, I heard a loud bang against the side of the house. Startled, I looked out the window and saw the man running toward his car. He limped as he ran, but he didn't stop. At that moment, the police arrived, and I watched from the window as they pulled up to the guy's car, stopping him before he could get away. It turned out he had planned to rob me all along. He'd hoped to catch me off guard, but when I didn't let him in, he became desperate. He even tried to climb a tree on the side of the house to reach my second-story window, but he missed, falling and injuring his leg. The police later told me they found a small knife in his pocket, confirming their suspicions. I was lucky I had locked up, and the police were able to handle it before things escalated further. Ever since then, I've been extra cautious when selling anything online. I never post an ad without verifying the beer first, and I always make sure every window and door is locked, even the ones I think are out of reach.
Story 3. iPad of Dread. I was looking for an iPad a while back, and one day, I stumbled upon an ad on Craigslist. The seller was offering an iPad for $200, claiming it was in mint condition. I didn't know much about checking devices for functionality, so I brought along my cousin, who knew a lot more than I did. We agreed to meet halfway at a local coffee shop around PM. When we arrived, two large guys stepped out of a black car and walked toward us. One of them pulled out the iPad and showed it to me. There wasn't a single scratch on it, and it looked as good as new. My cousin took a quick look at it, did some basic checks, and confirmed that it worked fine. The guy then told me the price was $250, even though he originally listed it for $200. I told him I only had $200, and though he seemed a bit unhappy about it, he accepted the money. We got back into my car and drove off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My cousin pointed out that the two guys had started their car just as we did, and that's when it struck me they were following us. I tried not to make a big deal out of it, but as I drove down the highway, I kept noticing their black car right behind us in my rearview mirror. I tried to shrug it off, but the more I drove, the closer they got. My cousin suggested pulling over to see if they just wanted to talk, but I had a feeling they weren't looking for any casual conversation. I decided to try to lose them. At an intersection, the light turned red, and without thinking too much, I floored the gas pedal, crossing the intersection before any other cars could pass. My cousin shouted at me, calling it reckless, but it worked. The black car didn't follow anymore. We finally got home, my heart racing from the whole ordeal. I thought it was over, and I had scored a good deal on the iPad. Later that night, I was setting up the iPad, testing out some apps, when suddenly, I heard two car doors slam shut outside. I froze, looking out the window, and there it was, the same black car parked across the street. Panic set in as I realized the two guys from earlier had followed me home. I rushed to wake up my dad and explained everything as quickly as possible. He grabbed a baseball bat, told me to stay inside, and hid behind the front door. A loud knock echoed through the house, and my dad yelled at them to leave. One of the guys on the other side claimed to have a gun and threatened to shoot the lock off if my dad didn't open the door. My dad told me to call his friend Ben, who was a police officer living 2 doors down. I dialed his number, and he assured me he'd be right over. That's when we heard the sound of a silenced shot. I peeked around the corner just in time to see a bullet hole appear in the door, inches away from my dad's head. My dad quickly moved away from the door, and we heard Ben outside, shouting at the guys to drop their weapons. A tense few moments passed before the sound of handcuffs clicked as Ben arrested the 2 men. It was the scariest night of my life, but it also felt like the biggest relief. Thanks to Ben, we were safe.